Being a medieval assassin was a terrifying experience. There is something strangely fascinating about the idea of a medieval assassin. We imagine a silent figure moving through a dark castle, wrapped in a black cloak, carrying a narrow blade, waiting patiently for the perfect moment. The victim never hears a sound. The assassin strikes, disappears into the night, and by sunrise nobody knows what happened. It is a powerful image. It is also mostly a modern fantasy. The real medieval world was far less convenient for anyone who wanted to kill another person secretly. There were no streetlights, no reliable maps, no instant communication, no cameras, no modern disguises, and certainly no easy way to disappear once people realized that a murder had taken place. And that is what makes the real story so interesting. Because if you were actually living in the medieval world, and someone powerful wanted another person dead, being the person asked to carry out that killing was probably not the glamorous occupation we imagine. It was dangerous. It was uncertain. It was physically exhausting. And perhaps worst of all, even if you succeeded, you could easily become the next person who needed to disappear. The medieval assassin, where such a figure existed, lived in a world where information moved slowly, but suspicion moved quickly. A rumor could travel from one village to another. A stranger could be remembered for weeks. A horse could be recognized. A servant could talk. A merchant could notice something unusual. A guard could become suspicious. And once a powerful victim was murdered, the people searching for the killer did not need modern forensic science to make life extremely uncomfortable. They had witnesses, they had neighbors, they had relatives, they had servants, they had political enemies, and they had one particularly useful tool: fear. Imagine waking before sunrise in a medieval town. The air is cold. The streets are uneven. Most people are still asleep. There is no electric light waiting for you outside your door. If you need to travel, you depend on whatever light nature gives you. Perhaps the moon. Perhaps a small lamp. Perhaps a torch. And sometimes nothing more than memory. You have been told where you need to go. You know who the target is. And you know that if anyone recognizes you, there may be no comfortable explanation for why you were there. That alone changes everything. A modern fictional assassin can study a building from a distance. A medieval killer had to understand a living environment. Who opens the gate? Who sleeps where? Which servant wakes early? Which dog barks? Which road is watched? Who knows the target personally? Which priest might hear a confession? Where can a stranger sleep without attracting attention? And perhaps most importantly, where can you go afterward? That final question was enormous. Killing someone was only the beginning. Getting away was another problem entirely. And the medieval world was not a small world. It only felt small because movement was slow. A journey that takes a modern traveler a few hours might take a medieval traveler an entire day or more. Roads could be muddy. Bridges could be damaged. Rivers could become dangerous. Weather could stop travel. Horses were expensive. Food had to be carried or purchased. And if you were traveling under suspicious circumstances, you could not simply assume that nobody would notice. Medieval communities were deeply social. People knew one another. They knew which families belonged where. They noticed outsiders. A stranger arriving at an inn was not automatically anonymous. The innkeeper might remember what you looked like. Another traveler might remember what you said. Someone might notice your accent. Someone might remember your clothing. Someone might notice your horse. The very things that made medieval society feel intimate and connected could make secrecy extremely difficult. This is one reason the popular image of the solitary medieval assassin is misleading. A successful political killing often required relationships. Someone had to provide information. Someone might provide access. Someone might provide transportation. Someone might arrange a meeting. Someone might lie afterward. And every additional person involved created another weakness. The more people who knew the plan, the more opportunities existed for betrayal. And medieval politics was full of betrayal. Power rarely existed peacefully. Kings struggled with nobles. Nobles struggled with rivals. Families fought over inheritance. Cities fought with lords. Church authorities struggled with secular rulers. Brothers could become enemies. Cousins could become political threats. A person who was powerful today could be dangerous tomorrow. That meant an assassin could find himself serving people whose loyalties were constantly changing. Imagine being hired by a powerful lord. You are promised money, perhaps protection, perhaps land, perhaps a position. Maybe you are told that the target is a traitor. Maybe you are told that the target deserves death. Maybe you are told that the killing is necessary for the safety of the realm. You do not necessarily know whether any of this is true. You only know that someone wants another person dead. And then you have to make a decision, because once the killing happens, your employer may not want you around anymore. This was one of the great dangers of political violence. The person who commits the deed is evidence. If a powerful man orders a murder and the killer remains alive, that killer can eventually become a liability. He can be arrested. He can be questioned. He can be bribed. He can be threatened. He can be tortured. He can tell the story. And sometimes, the easiest way to prevent a story from spreading is to remove the person who knows it. So even success could be dangerous. Perhaps especially success. This is why the fantasy of the assassin receiving a bag of gold and peacefully disappearing into another city feels so modern. Medieval society did not work like a crime movie. Gold itself could create questions. A poor man suddenly spending money might attract attention. A stranger suddenly possessing expensive clothing might attract attention. A man who had previously struggled to afford food might suddenly have a fine horse. Where did it come from? Who gave it to him? Why? Questions were dangerous, and money was not always easy to hide. The medieval economy depended heavily on visible relationships and material goods. Land mattered. Livestock mattered. Clothing mattered. Weapons mattered. Household possessions mattered. If you suddenly possessed something valuable, people could ask where it came from. And if the thing you possessed had recently belonged to a murdered man, the explanation might become even more uncomfortable. There was another problem. The medieval assassin did not have the luxury of reliable medical care. A fictional killer might get into a fight, receive a small cut, and continue running. Real injuries were different. A blade did not need to kill you to ruin your life. A wound could become infected. A broken finger could affect your ability to work. A damaged knee could make travel difficult. A deep cut could become life-threatening. And if your work involved violence, injuries were not unusual. The body itself became part of the problem. You could not simply reset it. There were no modern antibiotics, no emergency department, no sterile surgical environment, no reliable pain medication. Even a relatively minor injury could become a serious illness. And then there was the weapon. The medieval assassin did not necessarily have a special secret weapon designed for silent killing. Knives existed, daggers existed, swords existed. But using them effectively was not as simple as holding one. Weapons required skill. They required practice. They required strength. And in many circumstances, getting close enough to attack someone was extremely difficult. A nobleman might be surrounded by servants. A ruler might have guards. A wealthy merchant might travel with companions. A military commander might be accompanied by armed men. Even an ordinary person could be difficult to surprise if they knew that danger existed. And medieval people were not unfamiliar with violence. This is important. We sometimes imagine medieval people as helpless villagers who had never seen a weapon before. That is not accurate. Weapons were common. Military service was common in many societies. Feuds existed. Banditry existed. War existed. People understood that physical violence could happen. That meant a suspicious stranger carrying a weapon was not necessarily invisible. And if someone was caught carrying a weapon near an important person, the explanation mattered. A modern fictional assassin might say nothing. A medieval traveler might have to explain why he was there, why he had arrived, who he served, where he was staying, who knew him, who could confirm his identity, and those questions could become dangerous very quickly. Then there was the question of disguise. Movies love disguises. A hood, a monk's robe, a merchant's clothes, a servant's uniform. A medieval assassin changes appearance and walks through the castle gate. But clothing was not magic. If you dressed like a monk, people might expect you to behave like one. If you dressed like a merchant, someone might ask what you were selling. If you claimed to be a servant, someone might ask which household employed you. A disguise could create more questions than it answered. And medieval clothing was not designed for rapid transformation. You could not simply unzip one outfit and reveal another underneath. Clothing was expensive. It was often reused. It could identify social status. It could identify occupation. It could identify regional background. A person who looked wrong could stand out. This is one of the quiet problems with medieval secrecy. You did not have anonymity in the modern sense. People often belonged somewhere. They had families. They had occupations. They had communities. They had reputations. A person without a clear identity could become suspicious. And once suspicion began, it could grow. Suppose a powerful man is found dead. At first, nobody knows what happened. Then someone remembers a stranger. Perhaps he arrived 2 days earlier. Perhaps he asked questions. Perhaps he stayed at an inn. Perhaps he was seen near the victim's residence. One small memory becomes another. A servant remembers the stranger's boots. A stable boy remembers his horse. An innkeeper remembers the room he rented. A traveler remembers his accent. Suddenly, the unknown killer is not so unknown. This is where medieval investigations could become surprisingly sophisticated, even without modern technology. People gathered testimony. They questioned witnesses. They investigated relationships. They examined motives. They followed social connections. They looked for people who benefited from the death. They watched political rivals. They considered who had something to gain. And sometimes, the obvious suspect was not the actual killer, because political murder was rarely just about the person who died. It was about what happened after the death, who inherited, who gained influence, who lost protection, who controlled land, who gained access to the court, who became the next important person. The assassin might be only the visible hand of a much larger struggle. And this creates another uncomfortable reality. A medieval assassin might not even know the true reason for the killing. Perhaps the employer lied. Perhaps the target was described as a traitor. Perhaps the target was actually an innocent political obstacle. Perhaps the assassin believed he was serving justice. Perhaps he later discovered that he had been used. That possibility must have been psychologically difficult, because killing another human being is not something that becomes simple, merely because someone gives you an explanation. The medieval world had religious beliefs deeply woven into daily life. For many people, death was not considered the end of existence. The fate of the soul mattered. Sin mattered. Confession mattered. Repentance mattered. Judgment mattered. So an assassin might have to live not only with the fear of earthly punishment, but also with the fear of divine judgment. This does not mean every medieval killer was constantly terrified of hell. People held different beliefs. They justified violence in different ways. They belonged to different religious and cultural traditions. But religion provided a moral framework in which killing could carry consequences far beyond the immediate physical act. A person might seek confession. A person might attempt penance. A person might make donations. A person might try to repair his relationship with the church. But none of this made the killing disappear. The memory remained. And perhaps that is another reason the occupation was so unpleasant. You could leave a town. You could change your clothes. You could hide your weapon. But you could not necessarily leave your own memory behind. At night, when everything became quiet, the mind had plenty of room to remember. The sound of a door, the face of a person, the moment before the attack, the moment afterward, the realization that another human being had died because of something you had done. For a sleep-friendly story, it is easy to imagine the medieval night as peaceful, and in many places, it probably could be. But for someone carrying a secret, darkness might not feel peaceful at all. The night could become a long period of waiting. And waiting was one of the central experiences of life before modern technology. Waiting for dawn, waiting for a horse, waiting for a message, waiting for a traveler, waiting for a river to become safe, waiting for weather to improve, waiting to discover whether the authorities knew. And if you had committed a political killing, you might spend that entire time wondering whether someone had already named you. That uncertainty could be worse than immediate danger. Because immediate danger has a shape. Uncertainty does not. You could sit in a small room at an inn and hear footsteps outside. Perhaps they belonged to another traveler. Perhaps they belonged to guards. You would not know. You could hear knocking at the door. Your heart would react before your mind could explain why. Perhaps the innkeeper had simply come to collect payment. Perhaps someone had discovered your identity. Perhaps a local official had arrived. Perhaps nothing was wrong. But once you were afraid, every sound could become important. This was the world in which a medieval killer had to live. Not a world of perfect shadows and effortless escapes. A world of mud, cold, smoke, animals, crowded streets, suspicious neighbors, long journeys, limited information, and powerful people who could change their minds. The romantic image of the assassin depends on control. The real medieval world was full of things you could not control. Weather, disease, horses, roads, guards, servants, rumors, politics, your employer, your own body, and perhaps most importantly, chance. Chance was everywhere. You could plan carefully and still fail because someone woke unexpectedly. You could approach a building at the perfect time and discover that a feast was taking place. You could expect a quiet road and find travelers. You could hide for hours and discover that the target had already left. You could escape successfully and then become sick 3 days later. You could survive the killing and die from an ordinary infection. The medieval assassin did not live in a world where skill guaranteed success. Skill only improved the odds, and the odds could still be terrible. There is also an important historical distinction. The word assassin itself carries a complicated history. It is strongly associated with the medieval Nizari Ismaili community, particularly the group that European sources later described using forms of the word assassin. Their history is much more complicated than the popular image of a universal medieval secret society of killers. The Nizari Ismailis operated within the political world of the medieval Middle East, and their use of targeted killings became famous among their enemies and later chroniclers. But even here, the reality should not be reduced to the modern stereotype. Their history involved political strategy, fortified communities, religious identity, diplomacy, survival, and targeted violence. The famous mountain fortress associated with Alamut became deeply embedded in later legends. Stories grew around it. Travelers repeated accounts. European writers interpreted what they heard. Later generations added new details. Eventually, the medieval political phenomenon became part history and part legend. And the legendary version became far more dramatic than the historical reality. The image of the drugged young man, the secret garden, the promise of paradise, and the perfectly obedient killer became one of the most famous stories associated with the medieval assassins. But historians have long treated many of those details cautiously. The reality was more complicated. And that complexity matters because the actual medieval world was already strange enough. It does not need invented details to become fascinating. A person living in that world could be drawn into political violence without becoming a fictional super spy. He might be a soldier, a servant, a retainer, a political agent, a disgruntled official, a member of a faction, or someone whose ordinary role placed him close to a powerful person. That is another reason the idea of an assassin should be handled carefully. Medieval political violence did not always require a mysterious professional killer. Sometimes, the person closest to the victim was the person who created the greatest danger. A servant could have access. A relative could have access. A trusted companion could have access. A political ally could have access. And trust could make violence easier. This is one of the darkest lessons of medieval political history. The greatest security weakness was often not the castle wall. It was trust. A thick stone wall could stop an army. It could not stop a trusted person from opening a door. A locked gate could stop strangers. It could not necessarily stop someone who already had permission to enter. A guard could protect a ruler from an unknown attacker. But what if the person carrying the message was familiar? What if the visitor was expected? What if the danger came from someone who belonged inside? That is why the medieval assassin did not necessarily need extraordinary skill. He needed opportunity. And the opportunity often came from relationships. But relationships also created another problem. People talked. The medieval world was an oral world. Information moved through conversations. People told stories. They carried rumors. They remembered scandals. They repeated accusations. A secret was never truly safe, simply because it was spoken quietly. And political murder created enormous curiosity. If a famous person died unexpectedly, people wanted explanations. Was it illness? Was it poison? Was it war? Was it revenge? Was it divine punishment? Was it political murder? Every possibility created another story. And once a story began, it could become almost impossible to control. This meant that the assassin's greatest enemy might not be a knight chasing him down a road. It might be memory. Someone remembered him. Someone talked. Someone connected the pieces. Someone recognized his face. And the longer he remained alive, the more opportunities existed for the truth to emerge. That creates a strange paradox. The successful assassin wanted to disappear. But disappearing was difficult. The medieval world was connected through roads, markets, churches, ports, fairs, courts, monasteries, and trade. You could travel surprisingly far. But wherever you went, you entered another community. You still needed food. You still needed shelter. You still needed money. You still needed clothing. You still needed some explanation for your existence. And if your appearance suggested that you had something to hide, someone might become curious. There were also official systems of authority. They varied enormously by region and period. There was no single medieval police force covering Europe. But that did not mean there was no law enforcement. Local officials, sheriffs, reeves, bailiffs, guards, town authorities, courts, and other institutions could investigate wrongdoing depending on the place and period. Justice could be inconsistent. It could be harsh. It could be influenced by status. But the absence of modern policing did not mean that murderers simply vanished without consequence. In fact, the medieval legal world could be extremely interested in violent crime, and punishment could be severe. For a person caught after a politically motivated killing, the consequences could be catastrophic: imprisonment, confiscation, execution, torture in some contexts, public punishment, loss of property, punishment of associates. And even if the killer escaped, the consequences might extend to his family or political allies depending on the circumstances. This was not a world where violence ended neatly. Violence created consequences, and those consequences could continue for years. Imagine surviving the first few weeks. You have escaped. Nobody has caught you. The road behind you has disappeared into the distance. Perhaps you find work somewhere else. Perhaps you change your name. Perhaps you live quietly. At first, you might believe the danger has passed. But then a traveler arrives. He tells a story from another region. A famous man was murdered. The authorities are still searching. Someone has been arrested. Another person has confessed. A name has been mentioned. You listen quietly. And suddenly the past returns. That is the part of the assassin's life that stories often ignore. The waiting afterward. The knowledge that the deed is finished, but the consequences are not. Perhaps nobody ever discovers the truth. That was possible. History contains countless murders for which we do not know the perpetrator. But uncertainty works both ways. You do not know whether you are safe. You only know that you have not been caught yet. And that difference matters. The medieval world had another problem for anyone trying to remain hidden. Travel was exhausting. A person could not remain indefinitely on the road without consequences. Feet became sore. Clothing became dirty. Food cost money. Horses needed care. Roads were dangerous. Weather could become brutal. Winter could transform travel. Rain could turn roads into mud. Snow could block routes. Heat could make long journeys miserable. A medieval assassin could not simply flee across the map with unlimited resources. Distance was expensive. And if you traveled too quickly, you might attract attention. If you traveled too slowly, someone might catch up. Every choice involved risk. Even crossing a river could become a problem. Bridges were valuable. Ferries were useful. River crossings created natural bottlenecks. People gathered there. Travelers met one another. Officials might control access. If you were trying to disappear, a crowded crossing could be both useful and dangerous. The same was true of markets. Markets offered anonymity because many people were present, but they also offered witnesses. Someone could see you. Someone could hear you. Someone could recognize you. A large crowd did not guarantee invisibility. It only guaranteed more people, and more people meant more memories. This is why the medieval assassin's life, stripped of fantasy, becomes almost strangely mundane. Much of the danger came from ordinary things. Finding a place to sleep, finding food, keeping your clothes in reasonable condition, avoiding illness, getting from one town to another, finding trustworthy companions, avoiding people who asked too many questions, maintaining a believable story, and all of this while carrying the knowledge that somewhere behind you, a dead person had left a trail of consequences. The work was not glamorous. It was not elegant. It was not even necessarily professional. Often it was simply another form of political violence carried out by people living inside a violent political system. And perhaps that is why the title, Assassin, can be misleading. It suggests a profession, a stable occupation, a career. But medieval targeted killing was often connected to particular political circumstances. a feud, a succession crisis, a rebellion, a struggle for power, a religious conflict, a personal revenge, a military campaign. Once the political situation changed, the killer's usefulness could disappear. And when usefulness disappeared, protection might disappear with it. This brings us back to the greatest problem of all. Who could you trust? If your employer was powerful enough to order a murder, he was powerful enough to make your life extremely difficult. If your employer was weak, he might be unable to protect you. If your employer was defeated, you might become evidence against him. If your employer was victorious, he might still decide that you knew too much. There was no perfect arrangement. The assassin needed powerful allies. But powerful allies were dangerous. He needed secrecy. But secrecy was difficult. He needed mobility. But travel was difficult. He needed money. But sudden wealth could attract attention. He needed weapons. But weapons could identify him as dangerous. He needed confidence. But overconfidence could get him killed. And he needed luck. More than anything else, he needed luck. The medieval world was full of uncertainty. And if you were involved in political murder, uncertainty became part of your daily life. So when we imagine the medieval assassin, perhaps we should stop imagining the elegant figure moving effortlessly through moonlit corridors. Instead, imagine something quieter, a tired traveler, a person who has spent hours on a rough road, someone whose clothes smell of smoke and horses, someone who has not slept properly, someone who knows that the person he is looking for may be surrounded by guards, someone who does not know whether the promised payment will ever arrive, someone who does not know whether the person who hired him will protect him afterward, someone who understands that one mistake could end everything. And perhaps, somewhere along that road, he begins to wonder whether the money was worth it. Maybe he wonders whether the political cause was worth it. Maybe he wonders whether the person he killed really deserved to die. Maybe he wonders whether anyone will remember his name. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about medieval assassins. The people who ordered the killing might be remembered for centuries. Kings, princes, nobles, religious leaders, political rivals. But the person who actually carried out the killing often disappeared into the shadows of history. His name might never be recorded. His motives might never be known. His final destination might remain a mystery. He could become nothing more than a sentence in a chronicle, a shadow behind a famous death. And that may be the most fitting ending for an assassin. Not glory, not wealth, not a legendary escape. Just uncertainty. A life built around secrecy, eventually becoming a historical secret. And as the medieval night slowly settles over the roads, castles, towns, and villages, the world becomes quiet again. The people inside their houses sleep. The guards change shifts. The fires burn lower. The roads become darker. And somewhere beyond the walls, a traveler continues walking. He does not know what tomorrow will bring. He only knows that the past is behind him, or at least he hopes it is, because in the medieval world, the past had a way of following you. And for a person who had made a living from someone else's death, that was perhaps the greatest burden of all. The killing might take a moment. The fear afterward could last a lifetime. And that is why, when we look beyond the legends, The medieval assassin's life was not a story of effortless stealth and romantic danger. It was a story of uncertainty, of political violence, of fragile trust, of long roads, of cold nights, of difficult choices, and of a world where survival depended not only on courage or skill, but on whether fortune happened to be standing beside you when everything went wrong. And eventually, as morning slowly approached, there was always the same question waiting at the edge of the darkness. Who would still be alive when the sun came up? That question would carry the story forward, because the medieval world was not finished with its secrets yet. By the time the sun began to rise over the medieval countryside, the life of an assassin had already become a strange mixture of waiting, fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty. The night might be over, but the danger was not. For someone who had taken part in a political killing, morning did not necessarily mean safety. It simply meant that the world was becoming visible again. Roads filled with travelers. Markets began to open. Workers appeared. Animals were led outside. Church bells marked the beginning of another day. And somewhere among all those ordinary people, a person carrying an extraordinary secret had to continue living. That was perhaps the hardest part. The killing itself could be finished in moments. The consequences could last for years. And medieval society was not particularly forgiving when it came to people who threatened the political order. The powerful understood something very clearly. A ruler could survive a disagreement. A noble could survive an insult. A political rival could sometimes be negotiated with, but a dead rival could not negotiate. That made assassination terrifying, and it also made the people who carried it out extremely valuable for a short period of time. But being valuable and being safe were two completely different things. An assassin could be useful today and dangerous tomorrow. That distinction could determine whether he lived. Imagine being the person who knows exactly how a powerful man died. You know who arranged the meeting. You know who provided the information. You know who paid for the operation. You know which political faction benefited. Perhaps you know where the weapons came from. Perhaps you know which servant helped. Perhaps you know who opened the door. You are walking evidence. And evidence is dangerous. This is why secrecy was not simply a professional requirement. It was a survival mechanism. You could not boast. You could not tell stories in taverns. You could not casually mention what you had done. You could not become drunk and begin speaking about powerful people, because medieval taverns were places where information traveled. A careless sentence could move farther than you expected. Someone might remember it. Someone might repeat it. Someone might tell another person. And eventually, your secret might become someone else's opportunity. This is one of the most important things to understand about medieval political violence. People had incentives to betray one another. Suppose two men participated in a killing. If one of them was arrested, he might try to save himself by accusing the other. If someone wanted a reward, he might provide information. If a political faction changed sides, yesterday's allies could become today's enemies. If a ruler was overthrown, people connected to the previous regime might suddenly become targets. Political loyalty could change remarkably quickly. And the assassin lived in the middle of all of it. There was no modern contract guaranteeing protection. There was no anonymous bank account. There was no secure witness protection program. There was no distant country where you could instantly disappear with a new identity. If the political situation changed, your entire safety network could collapse. A castle that once protected you could become a prison. A patron who once welcomed you could order your arrest. A friend could become an informant. A political ally could become your enemy. And the person you thought you had served might decide that the safest way to protect himself was to deny ever knowing you. That possibility must have been terrifying. Because if your entire life depended on someone else's power, then your survival was never completely your own. You could be brave, you could be skilled, you could be careful, but you could not control the political world around you. And medieval politics could change very quickly. Kings died, princes rebelled, armies arrived, castles changed hands. Treaties were signed. Treaties were broken. Families fought. Heirs disappeared. New rulers rewarded their supporters and punished the supporters of the old regime. A person who had been protected under one ruler could become an enemy under another. And this meant that an assassin could spend years looking over his shoulder. Not necessarily because someone was actively chasing him, sometimes simply because he knew that someone could. That distinction is important. Fear does not require a pursuer. It only requires uncertainty. You hear a horse approaching. You wonder who is riding it. You see armed men on the road. You wonder where they are going. A messenger arrives at the inn. You wonder whether he carries your name. A stranger asks where you came from. You wonder why he wants to know. A local official looks at you for slightly too long. You wonder whether he recognizes you. This is how paranoia grows. Not through constant attacks, but through endless possibilities. And for someone who had already committed political violence, ordinary life could become a collection of suspicious moments. Perhaps the assassin eventually tried to become ordinary. That might have been the only way to survive. Find work, keep quiet, build relationships, stay away from politics. Avoid expensive possessions. Do not draw attention. Do not boast. Do not ask too many questions. Do not become too close to powerful people. And perhaps most importantly, do not become famous. Because fame was the opposite of what an assassin needed. The ideal assassin was forgotten. And forgetting was easier when nobody knew who you were. This is one reason the historical record is so incomplete. Medieval chronicles often focused on rulers, wars, bishops, nobles, battles, treaties, and major political events. Ordinary people frequently disappeared from written history. A man who carried out a killing might have been extremely important for one night, and completely invisible afterward. If he was never identified, historians may never know his name. If his employer concealed the operation, the evidence could disappear. If the killing was later attributed to another cause, the real story might become impossible to recover. And sometimes the only evidence is a suspicious statement in a chronicle. A ruler died. A rival benefited. Someone was rumored to have arranged it. But rumor is not proof. That is why medieval assassination stories must be treated carefully. Later writers sometimes loved dramatic explanations. They wanted mysterious killers, secret societies, poisoned cups, hidden tunnels, midnight meetings, dark cloaks, exotic weapons, secret messages. But real history is often quieter. Sometimes a political killing was simply the result of people using the tools available to them. Violence, loyalty, money, fear, opportunity, and information. That is enough to create a deadly situation. The medieval world did not need supernatural assassins. Human beings were already capable of extraordinary political violence, and that violence was not always hidden. Sometimes a killing was intended to send a message. That is another important difference between assassination and ordinary murder. A political killing could be symbolic. The identity of the victim mattered. The place mattered. The timing mattered. The people who learned about the death mattered. Sometimes the goal was not simply to remove one person. It was to demonstrate power, to frighten supporters, to weaken a faction, to send a warning, to show that a ruler could reach an enemy even when protected. In such cases, secrecy could actually be less important than we imagine. The killing itself could become part of political communication. But that created another danger for the assassin. The more visible the killing became, the more pressure there was to identify the person responsible. And if the political message was important enough, the authorities might pursue the killers aggressively. This is where the romantic image of the assassin breaks down again. A fictional assassin can choose when to disappear. A real medieval killer could be forced to run, and running was exhausting. You had to eat, you had to sleep, you had to find shelter, you had to care for your horse if you had one. You had to cross difficult terrain. You had to decide which roads were safe. You had to avoid places where someone might recognize you. You had to keep moving without appearing to run. That last part was especially difficult. A person who suddenly fled a region could attract attention. Why is he leaving? Why so quickly? Why is he traveling alone? Why is he carrying weapons? Why did he arrive here? Why is he now gone? Questions were dangerous, and the medieval world was full of people who noticed unusual behavior, not because medieval people were constantly investigating crimes, but because communities were interconnected. People relied on one another. The local blacksmith knew customers. The innkeeper knew travelers. The priest knew families. The merchant knew other merchants. The stableman knew horses. The gatekeeper knew who entered. The village knew who belonged. That social network could make life safer for ordinary people. But for a fugitive, it could become a net. There was nowhere to be completely invisible. Even monasteries, which offered religious sanctuary in some circumstances, were not magical hiding places. Church institutions could provide protection in certain contexts, but sanctuary had legal and practical limits, and the exact rules varied by place and period. A person could not assume that entering a sacred space made him untouchable forever. Politics could reach religious institutions too. Power existed everywhere. And that is one of the great themes of medieval life. You could escape one authority only to encounter another. A lord controlled land. A town controlled markets. A church controlled religious life. A king claimed political authority. Local officials enforced laws. Guilds controlled professions. Families controlled relationships. No single institution controlled everything. but many institutions controlled something. The assassin had to navigate all of them. And perhaps that made the medieval world especially difficult for someone living outside normal social boundaries. A person without a stable identity was vulnerable. People needed communities. They needed patrons. They needed family. They needed work. They needed reputation. The assassin's problem was that secrecy could require the opposite. He needed distance. He needed silence. He needed to avoid questions. He needed to avoid becoming too familiar. But surviving required connections. That contradiction could not easily be solved. And it brings us to another uncomfortable question. Why would anyone agree to become involved in political killing in the first place? The answer was probably different for different people. Money, loyalty, fear, revenge, religious conviction, political belief, personal ambition, coercion, social pressure. Sometimes a person may have believed that the victim truly deserved death. Sometimes the person carrying out violence may have considered himself a soldier rather than a criminal. Sometimes the distinction between warfare and assassination could become blurred. A man could kill an enemy in battle and be praised. The same man could kill that enemy while he slept and be condemned. The difference often depended on circumstances, politics, and social expectations. Medieval societies did not have one universal attitude toward killing. Ideas about legitimate violence varied. Rulers could order executions. Soldiers could kill in war. Feuding families could pursue revenge. Courts could impose death sentences. Religious authorities could condemn certain forms of violence while supporting others under particular conditions. So the medieval assassin existed inside a complicated moral landscape. He was not simply a person who woke up one morning and decided that murder was his profession. Sometimes he could be operating within a system that had already normalized violence. And perhaps that is why the psychological burden could be complicated too. A person could tell himself that he had done his duty. He could tell himself that the target was dangerous. He could tell himself that someone else would have done it. He could tell himself that the killing prevented a war. Human beings have always been capable of creating moral explanations for difficult actions. But explanations do not necessarily remove consequences. The face of the dead person might remain in memory. And if the assassin was religious, questions about sin and repentance could become deeply personal. Could the killing be forgiven? Was the victim truly an enemy? Was the command legitimate? Had the assassin been deceived? Could repentance undo the act? Medieval religious culture offered ways of thinking about guilt, confession, penance, salvation, and judgment. But these were not simple psychological solutions. The person still had to live with what had happened. And living with a secret could become its own form of punishment. There is something strangely peaceful about the image of a medieval night. A small fire, a quiet room, the sound of wind outside, the distant barking of a dog, the occasional movement of a guard. But for someone carrying a deadly secret, peaceful surroundings might create the perfect environment for uncomfortable thoughts. When there was nothing else to do, the mind could return to the past. And the assassin could not know whether the future would be better. Maybe he would escape. Maybe he would be caught. Maybe his employer would reward him. Maybe his employer would betray him. Maybe nobody would ever know. Maybe someone already knew. Every possibility remained open. This is why the life of a medieval assassin was probably less about dramatic action than about uncertainty between dramatic moments. Most of the time, there was no attack. There was waiting, travel, observation, conversation, planning, eating, sleeping, trying to appear normal. That is almost disappointingly ordinary, but it is precisely what makes the reality interesting. The assassin was still a human being. He got tired. He became hungry. He became cold. He became sick. He needed sleep. He could make mistakes. He could become afraid. He could fall in love. He could have family. He could regret decisions. He could want to stop, and stopping might be difficult. If your livelihood depended on violence, leaving violence behind was not always easy. Perhaps you had enemies. Perhaps you had no other profession. Perhaps your employer expected continued loyalty. Perhaps you knew too much. Perhaps other people knew what you had done. And once a person became associated with political violence, returning to ordinary life could be difficult. Reputation mattered. If people knew you were dangerous, they might fear you. If they knew you had killed someone important, they might avoid you. If they knew you had served a particular faction, they might distrust you. A person could become trapped by his own history, and history itself could be unforgiving. Centuries later, we might look at a medieval assassination and see a dramatic story, but the person who lived it did not know how the story would end. He did not know whether historians would remember the event. He did not know whether his name would survive. He did not know whether future generations would call him a villain, a hero, a servant, a traitor, or nothing at all. He only knew what was happening to him. That uncertainty is easy to forget when we look backward. History gives us the ending. People living through history did not have that advantage. They lived without knowing what tomorrow would bring. For an assassin, that uncertainty must have been especially intense, because every political shift could become personal. Every rumor could become dangerous. Every new ruler could change the meaning of the past. And every friend could become a liability. Perhaps the most difficult part was that there was no clean way to retire. You could stop killing, but you could not necessarily stop being the person who had killed. The memory remained. The relationships remained. The rumors remained. And if the political world remembered your actions, you remained connected to them whether you wanted to or not. This is why the medieval assassin's greatest enemy may not have been a sword. It may have been time. Time allowed memories to spread. Time allowed political circumstances to change. Time allowed former allies to become enemies. Time allowed rumors to grow. Time allowed witnesses to speak. And time allowed the assassin to realize that the reward he had received was temporary, while the consequences could last forever. The famous image of the assassin is therefore almost upside down. We imagine a man who fears nothing. But the reality may have been a person who had many reasons to fear. We imagine someone who controlled every situation. But the medieval world was full of uncontrollable events. We imagine someone who moved silently through history. But his survival depended on other people. We imagine someone who became rich from killing. But payment could be uncertain. We imagine someone who escaped easily. But medieval travel was slow and difficult. We imagine someone who disappeared. But disappearing required more than walking into the darkness. It required becoming socially invisible, and that was extraordinarily difficult. You needed an identity. You needed a reason for being somewhere. You needed food. You needed shelter. You needed money. You needed a believable story. And you needed luck. Perhaps more luck than skill. Because the medieval world was unpredictable. A single unexpected person could ruin an entire plan. A servant could enter at the wrong moment. A guard could change position. A horse could become frightened. A door could be locked. A messenger could arrive. A storm could delay travel. An illness could weaken you. A political alliance could collapse. A rival could reveal your name. A single careless sentence could destroy months of secrecy. There was no way to eliminate all those possibilities. And so the assassin lived with risk. Not the glamorous risk of a story. The ordinary, exhausting risk of uncertainty. That is why it truly sucked to be a medieval assassin. Not because every day was a spectacular chase, quite the opposite. Because most days were probably filled with ordinary discomfort, while the possibility of catastrophe remained somewhere in the background. Cold nights, bad roads, limited food, poor sleep, injuries, suspicion, political instability, uncertain payment, uncertain loyalty, and the constant knowledge that the person who hired you might be just as dangerous as the person you were hired to kill. There was no perfect escape, no guaranteed retirement, no clean ending. Only another road, another town, another room, another night, and another morning. Eventually, perhaps, the assassin would become old. His body would no longer move as quickly. His injuries would become more noticeable. His memories would become heavier. The political world that once seemed so urgent would change. The people he once served might be dead. The enemies he once feared might be forgotten. The kingdom might have changed rulers. The borders might have changed. The factions might have disappeared. And yet the assassin would still remember. That is another quiet tragedy of political violence. The world moves on. The person who carried out the violence has to move on too. But memory does not always move at the same speed. A man might spend one night changing the political future of a kingdom, then spend the next 30 years trying to live with that night. And perhaps nobody else would ever understand what happened. No modern documentary camera, no recorded interview, no detailed personal diary, no final confession preserved for centuries. Just silence. The assassin disappears. The victim becomes history. The political struggle continues. And eventually, the original human beings become names in books. That is how history can make violence look cleaner than it really was. We see the event. We see the consequences. We do not always see the fear between them. We do not see the tired traveler sitting alone. We do not see the person wondering whether the door will open. We do not see the person counting coins. We do not see the person worrying about betrayal. We do not see the person trying to sleep while remembering what happened. But those human moments are part of the story too. And perhaps that is where we should leave the medieval assassin. Not in a dramatic castle corridor. Not with a perfect escape. Not with a mysterious cloak disappearing into the night. But somewhere much quieter. A small room. A tired person. A fading fire. The distant sound of footsteps that may mean nothing. The knowledge that tomorrow will come whether he is ready for it or not. Outside, the medieval world continues. Farmers prepare for another day. Merchants open their stalls. Workers begin their labor. Children wake. Animals move through the streets. Church bells mark the hours. Life continues. And the assassin, for a brief moment, is simply another human being waiting for morning. Perhaps he survived. Perhaps he did not. Perhaps his employer kept his promise. Perhaps he was betrayed. Perhaps he escaped into another region and lived quietly for the rest of his life. Perhaps he was caught. Perhaps nobody ever discovered the truth. History cannot always answer, and maybe that uncertainty is appropriate, because the medieval assassin lived in a world where certainty was rare. There were no instant answers, no instant communication, no guaranteed safety, no perfect information. Every journey was uncertain. Every political alliance was uncertain. Every illness was uncertain. Every secret was uncertain. And every sunrise brought another day in which something could go terribly wrong. The romantic legend gives the assassin control. The historical reality gives him uncertainty. And when we strip away the legends, the mystery, the dramatic costumes, and the modern imagination, what remains is surprisingly simple. The medieval assassin was a human being trying to survive in a dangerous political world. He could be skilled, could be courageous, he could be ruthless, he could be loyal, he could be frightened, he could be ambitious, he could be manipulated, but he could never completely control what happened next. And that is perhaps the most important lesson. The hardest part of being a medieval assassin was not necessarily killing. It was everything that came afterward. The silence, the waiting, the uncertainty, the possibility of betrayal. The long road home, the absence of home, the fear of recognition, the fear of punishment, the fear of political change, the fear of memory, and finally, the realization that even if you succeeded perfectly, you might still lose everything. Because a successful assassination did not guarantee a successful life. It only guaranteed that one person was dead. Everything else remained uncertain. And somewhere, perhaps, another political struggle was already beginning. Another rival was rising. Another alliance was forming. Another secret was being whispered. Another name was being mentioned. Another person was being watched. And another assassin, somewhere in the medieval world, was beginning the same long journey into uncertainty. The road was waiting. The night was waiting. And eventually, morning would come again, just as it always did. And perhaps that was the only certainty a medieval assassin could truly depend on. The sun would rise, the world would continue, and whatever had happened during the darkness would have to be carried into another day.